Hello. Right, I think we are live. I'm just going to bring the speaker chat up. So the chat. Good. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm very appreciative of the fact that you're all very busy. Hold on, we've got a question here. Has this begun? Can people see me? Do you want to just type in the chat, make sure it is all live and running and you can see everything? Any of the guests, can you just give me if you hit the chat button? Yeah, it looks like you're all there. Brilliant. Okay, I will crack on then. We'll get on to the fact that this is a new platform in a second. So thank you so much for coming. We had an amazing response to today's seminar. We really did, and it just impresses upon us how important this topic is. It's something that, even though I help run these events, I'm a young professional like you and share those anxieties about how far our paycheck is going to go at the end of the month, about what I should be doing with my money, ethical concerns, environmental concerns, all of those things. So it really was a perfect time for Path Financial to come along. They really align with our thinking. They are very much not the sort of stuffy traditional view that people may have about wealth managers or financial planners. They are very much, their whole business model is focused on ethical and environmental impact of everything they do. So they really do align with us. We have Jack and James here speaking with us today. They are going to be running through different sections each. And what I suggest question-wise, if you pop any questions in the box as we go, what they can then do is at the end of each session, go back and forth and answer one or two of those. Last thing for me to say is we're using this brand new system, Get Contrast. It lets us live stream, edit, distribute and host our content, which is the interesting bit for all of us. There will be a page at the end of this where everyone can find all of our future virtual events. It means we can also circulate it and all that sort of stuff. So anyone that you know that maybe wants to see this afterwards, if you want to catch up on it, anything like that, you can. And what I'll do, I know there's a few sort of event hosts, content creators, all that sort of stuff actually watching today. And so I've pinged a link in there. If any of you want a demo or anything like that to use this going forward, just click on that and you'll get in touch with the lovely Max from Contrast. Good. All right. I'm going to hand straight over to the first speaker and enjoy, everyone.
Thanks, Ollie. I believe I'm audible and visible, and you should have a slides up in front of you. So start tapping away in the chat box if there's any problems. The first thing I need to cover off is just a bit of housekeeping. So some exciting risk warnings for you. So any performance figures that are quoted today, they can't be used as a guide to future returns, and the information presented should not be considered formal investment advice, unfortunately, as we're talking on a top-level basis and without reference to a specific individual circumstances. So let's crack on. So thanks very much for your time. Obviously, thanks Ollie and team and Theo for working with us to get this all in place. I realise bios were provided with the invite, but hello, I'm James. I've been with Path Financial since December, and before that, I spent 6 years in London, London-based wealth manager, working with high net worth individuals and going through my exams and advice authorization and that sort of thing. My thoughts are on the industry as a whole that financial planning probably has some modernising to do, and that part of that is just simply getting more people engaging with the topic, which to some people can seem daunting and or boring. So hopefully we provide a bit of clarity on some simple options available to you today. I'll let Jack introduce himself if you're...
I should be here.
Come on, Jack.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. As James said, we appreciate that and investments can be somewhat complex and boring even, and financial planning can sometimes lead to a bit of a ostrich head in the sand mentality. And so what we're here to do is, try and provide some clarity and some insights that might, make it a bit easier to kind of wade through the minefield and actually maybe even be interesting. So I'll hand back to James and I'll see you later.
Cheers, Jack. Yeah, so in terms of background for the session, we've got some sort of simple real-world applicable content. There should be time at the end for questions, but Ollie's already said that, bank them up, and by the end of my sort of session, as we'll go through if any have come up during my bit. So when we started talking to Ollie and the team ahead of this session, we kind of agreed that the cost of living was on everyone's lips. So let's briefly address the context of where we find ourselves as a group. So I put some headlines up here because it's quite easy, isn't it, looking at the news to create doomsday scenarios. But there's no question that the last 2 years have been unique. So all the younger generations, pretty much everyone on this call, has known is a low interest and low inflationary environment. So debt's been cheap. Since 2009, the US stock market has been in its longest bull run in history. So a sustained increase in share prices over that time, which ended because of COVID in March 2020. And then in the UK, at least, when we saw the sort of green shoots of the end of COVID restrictions, the invasion of Ukraine began. So the culmination of these events and, of course, other factors has led to an energy-led and supply chain disrupted increase in the cost of living. So for the audience here today, that comes at a time when your focus is probably just a simple combination of, working hard and getting ahead in your career, enjoying your free time without the various extra responsibilities that arise as you get older. And that may be the simple balance, perhaps going through exams or something like that. So the cost of living and the increases in the cost of living affects everyone, no question. So whilst today with the fundamentals we're talking to you about should be helpful building blocks for a long-term strategy, just bear in mind, if your immediate focus is on covering your bills, then let that be your focus, because there's no quick fix for larger economic disruption, which will come and go throughout our lives. But a good strategy will keep you on the course through these sort of tighter periods. They've happened before and they'll happen again. In addition to economic insecurity, it's probably fair to argue that we're at a bit of an inflection point as well with regards to the global economy. So what I mean by that is, if you go back to the 1700s, we had a coal-driven industrial revolution. And since then, we've seen a gas-driven revolution, which was sort of during Victorian times. And in the 1960s and 70s, we had a electronics and nuclear energy revolution. So where are we at now? Well, sort of post-millennium, we're more an internet and renewables-driven, again, industrial revolution. And the reason I say that is that the times between these seems to be shrinking. And as we know, the rate of sort of tech advancement means that any changes we see in, say, the next 10 years will probably eclipse what we would previously have seen in 100 years or so. Why do I say that? Well, it's kind of to make the point that despite all this noise and uncertainty and doom and gloom headlines sometimes, fundamentally, you've got to not lose sight of your personal timeline. So we all know how our timeline ends, and there's going to be no point between now and then when we'll ever be able to control, to any meaningful extent, geopolitical events, right? Or wider economic factors. So I suspect our entire audience lies on the orange part of this chart here. So major events like house purchases, children perhaps, that sort of thing is still to come. So of course, the sooner we start to regularly save for these events, even at very low levels, the more your money can work for you rather than the other way around. Financial markets and the ease of use of apps make it very possible to earn money whilst you sleep, and compounding returns, that is returns on returns over time, can rack up very quickly as a benefit. So don't underestimate the possible upside to making regular monthly investments over the course of just 5 years, let alone employing this strategy over tens of years. Apparently, Albert Einstein referred to compound interest as the eighth wonder of the world, and those who understand it earn it, and those who don't pay it. So I'm happy to defer to his judgment on that matter. One point I would add about this timeline here is, and it's probably very useful for the audience to sort of understand this, is that on average, the build-up of wealth does take quite a long time, and it kind of snowballs, and then before you know it, you look back and go, oh, I'm in a sort of very comfortable position now. It's not just like a thing that will happen, say, in your mid-20s. So for career-type individuals, pay generally continues to grow into your mid-40s. By the time that starts to level out, you might have a meaningful equity in property that you own, and the receipt of inheritances may also start to factor into your financial situation. So in other words, don't try and have it all figured out too soon. In general terms, wealth will come later on in life, and with that comes additional financial strategies that aren't really relevant to today's discussion. So all that being said, it's all very well and good knowing your timeline, but we should probably turn our attention to where you can put your money, including the sort of homes that is relevant for the people on this for the audience here today. So one option is a pension. Many of you will work for large organizations and you'll be accumulating pension benefits in something called an occupational pension. Modern workplace pensions are defined contribution in nature, which essentially means their value fluctuates with the market they're invested. In contrast, there used to be something, and they do still exist a bit, called defined benefit pensions, which are kind of linked to your salary essentially and earnings over a period of employment. But that's not the norm for modern workplace pensions, and they're a huge liability for company balance sheets, so they don't tend to be a benefit anymore. So back to defined contribution pensions that you're sort of accruing yourselves now. The underlying investments within those pensions are growing free of dividend tax, and they're growing free of capital gains tax. So, and also bear in mind that any contributions made also receive other tax benefits like income tax relief or national insurance relief. Generally, you're not going to notice these contributions being made unless you go looking for them on your payroll portal or look at your pay slips, because they're taken before tax. The benefit of contributing is that your employer these days will typically contribute on your behalf too. So it's, I think, a legal minimum of 3% on their behalf. But bear in mind that the underlying investments tend to be chosen for you at outset. So they're usually in pre-selected default fund options, which we'll touch on again later, though you are able to change this. When you start an employment, you may be given the option to opt out of paying into your pension, which would mean that your contributions don't go in and you get that in your paycheck. But this would result in your employer also not contributing. So effectively, you're receiving a pay cut, really, with something that was originally going into your pocket, instead staying with your employer. So I've not had many discussions with people that have decided to opt out of them, and in general, there wouldn't be much of a purpose to not building up your retirement pot. So it's pretty much a win-win. In addition to workplace pensions, you can set up a personal or private pension and make further contributions to it directly. Any payments that you make into that would be from your taxed income, so from your paycheck that you receive in your bank account. But you would receive top-up payments from the government. So 20% would automatically be added to the contribution. And if you're a higher or additional rate taxpayer, further tax relief would be available from your sort of self-assessment tax returns. So in other words, whichever way you're contributing to pensions, tax benefits exist. And just to sort of let you know that any contribution amounts made to personal or private pension should be added to contributions made through a workplace pension. So this is to ensure you don't breach an annual allowance of £40,000 a year. Although I will say that there are rules that increase and decrease this figure, but generally just take £40,000 as the cap you're able to put into a pension in any given year, the gross amount. Moving to the sort of middle option in front of us here is an individual savings account. And I think this might be a better fit for some of you to consider, because if you're accruing pension benefits for a work scheme or private pension scheme, the money is locked away to age 57. It was 55, and if you're retiring after 2028, it's rising to age 57. So ISAs may not get the same tax breaks as pensions, but the underlying investments still grow free of tax, capital gains and dividend tax. So they have that gross roll-up of compounding returns over time, which is still a huge benefit. Cash ISAs and stocks and shares ISAs are pretty much the most common types, although there's several others. And we'll talk a bit more about the trade-off between cash and investing in stocks and shares shortly. But I guess, a key differentiator, and this is pretty important when you're comparing ISAs and pensions, is that ISAs can be accessed at any time. So you don't have to wait to a certain age to withdraw your money. Finally, if we just sort of turn our attention to the item on the right-hand side of the slide, the lifetime ISA. So these are also known as LISAs for obvious reasons, but contributions to these form part of your annual allowance for ISAs, which is £20,000 a year. So for lifetime ISAs, you can add up to £4,000 each year, with the government adding £1,000 as a bonus. So it's effectively like a 25% return from the government. And the bonus itself does not count towards the £20,000 ISA limit. So you could do £16,000 in one type of ISA, £4,000 in the lifetime ISA. And even before investing the underlying money, you've got that £1,000 bonus return. The main purpose of a lifetime ISA as a product is to put the money towards the purchase of a home for first-time buyers only. So there are rules attached to this, which are the property value should not exceed £450,000, meaning it's more restrictive in and around London. I think you also have to buy it with a mortgage attached as well. And if not used for the purchase of your first home, it does have other uses. So it could instead act as like a pseudo pension in a way, because you can access it from age 60. But just bear in mind, if the lifetime ISA is not used to purchase your first home under those prescribed rules and under the value of £450,000, and you withdraw your money before age 60, penalties will apply, and it essentially would not have been worth going in because the penalties more than take away the £1,000 bonuses. So it's a great product to be aware of, but if you're going to go into it, just be clear with yourself about why you're doing so before doing so. So let's say if an individual wanted to save for a house in the medium term, say the next 5 or 10 years, an ISA would be a suitable option, whereas a pension would not. And we're not trying to discourage additional pension savings, which, when you're older, you'd be glad you made, but to realise that at younger ages, accessibility to the wrappers you're investing in is a key concern. A final option I've not mentioned is cash in the bank. Going back to the topic of the cost of living where we started, inflation means, and the rate of inflation these days means that we have to look at cash in a way we haven't had to do so for over a decade. So this is the point where I'd look to hand over to Jack, but I appreciate there might have been some questions racking up in the chat potentially. So I don't know, has anyone mentioned anything?
Yeah, we've got one question, which is about if you've paid money into a LISA, but it can no longer be used for a house deposit. What are the options? Do you take the 25% hit of withdrawing it, or do you leave it? So I'll just say on this, at that point, it effectively becomes a pension, and it will depend on your own circumstances about what's right to do with that. From a kind of purely tax efficiency point of view, you want to keep it in there until age 60 and then view it as part of your pension savings. And we'll come on to the right investments for that. But of course, you do have the option of withdrawing it. And that will depend on whether you think you need the money now or not. If you don't need the money and you can put it towards that longer term saving, or you can put it towards longer term saving and then maybe put something you would have put in your pension and keep that as cash and replenish it that way, then that would be better from a tax efficiency point of view. But of course we appreciate that it's not always about the tax efficiency. If you need the money, you need the money, right? Lastly, if you were to take it out the license now and take the 25% hit, that 25% hit would be less than if you took it out in 10 years time, because it's probably grown in that time. And so the hit will be more later on. So that's one other thing to think about. James, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't, because that's sort of all bases covered, I think. So yeah, I see that was the only question that come through so far. So on that note, I guess I'll hand over to you, Jack.
Yeah, we've just got one other question.
Right?
There's a couple of other questions. One about the returns of an ISA, and we'll come on to that later. There's another question which I think is probably relevant just now, about moving pension scheme and transitioning from a kind of private pension to an occupational pension to a private pension. So I don't know if you want to cover that, or if I can as well, because I've read it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really common thing. Obviously, people jumping around employers, and I've already had 2 before joining the path. So what I've tended to do is consolidate them over time. What we've seen, I imagine Jack will have had the same experience working with clients, is that they get to their 50s or 60s and they've got a shed load of pension pots dotted around. They've paid no attention to them, and they're just kind of sat there. So there is an argument about the underlying investments and whether you have a cheaper option going elsewhere. But as much as anything, it's administratively sort of simpler to do it as you go throughout your career. So I'm not quite sure necessarily what the question is, apart from, yes, it's commonplace to be proactive about it. It's certainly what I would look to do for my own pensions.
I've just reread the
question. Employer,
I've just reread the question as well, and slightly didn't do it justice in terms of its meaning. So actually, it's talking about, if you opt out of a pension, can you then withdraw the funds? And the simple answer is no. Once you've paid the money into a pension, you are subject to accessing it at the minimum pension age, which is age 57. So you can transfer it to a private pension and invest it, and we can come on to that. But in terms of withdrawing it, no, you can't. Okay, great. So yeah, I think that was everything for questions. There may be more at the end, so we can pick those up.
Okay, great. I'll hand over to you.
Great. Great. So yeah, James has gone over the types of pots and the purposes that each of those might serve. And starting to get into why it's important to try and compartmentalize what is the objective of this pot. So pensions, retirement, ISA might be shorter term, and so I'm going to come on to talking about, okay, you've got your different pots, what do you put in it? And so the money needs to be invested, or perhaps not, as the case may be. So when it comes to deciding what to do with your money in these different wrappers, you have 3 broad options, or a combination of these. So firstly, you can actually just leave it as cash. You're not obliged to invest your money in your pension or your ISA, even if it's a stocks and shares ISA. Each of these accounts will just have a cash account. And this might be useful if you intend to use the money soon. So for example, cash in a ISA, if you're using it for a house deposit, in the next couple of months, you probably want that in cash, because what you don't want to be is in a position where market falls 30% and your house deposit has fallen 30% with that, and then you can't buy the house that you want. Otherwise, other scenarios might be, you're approaching retirement and you want to start taking money out the pension, in which case, cash has its purpose there. But in most cases, you're probably saving for the long term, or at least the medium term. And so if you have your money in cash, unfortunately, inflation will erode the value. And over the last 10 years, that hasn't been so much of an issue, but you've probably seen, in the last 6 months, inflation has reared its head again. And essentially, with inflation of 5-7%, your cash is, loses that value each year. So, over 1-2 years, that's not so bad. Over 30 years, that becomes a bit of a problem. And so the 2 main ways to, then invest to try and, keep up with inflation would be via direct holdings. So you can invest, directly in Shell, BP, Tesla, Barclays, one of the many shares, or, more commonly via what we call pooled investments. So funds. So you may have heard of companies like Schroders, Baillie Gifford, Aviva, BlackRock, where investment managers will, invest your money in lots of companies, so you can spread the risk by that direction. What you can invest in will be determined by the investment options for that particular account. So different pensions will have different, and ISAs will have different investment options. So before you can kind of decide what to invest in, you have to actually go on to your, Aviva pension or BlackRock pension or Hargreaves Lansdown ISA and look at the investment options. And so that's the first point, because that will give you, the range of what you can decide to do. Direct holdings in general might be slightly more exciting because you can select individual companies that you like, CEOs that you like, follow their story, but that does come with higher risk, because you're not just, the share price will not just fluctuate depending on market conditions and global factors, but also the individual factors that impact that company. So, think of an Elon Musk tweet, or, probably more commonly, mismanagement of a company. So most people will invest in funds, and that spreads the risk by, rather than just having one company, you've got 30, 40, 80 companies, so that your money has been split between. And so when you're coming to funds, there's different types of funds that you can choose. So you have equity funds, and they invest in stocks and shares. So they're probably, easiest to understand. Then you can have fixed interest bond funds. That's where the investment managers loan money to corporations and governments, and you get back the loan with interest, much like a mortgage or, a bank loan. You also have commercial property funds. So that's bricks and mortar, supermarkets, offices, warehouses, and you get the rent off that, plus any, appreciation in office buildings. Of course, with that comes, potential liquidity. It's not, you can't sell a portion of an office normally, so there's some issues around that. And then also you have mixed investment funds. So this is where you can get all of those different types of assets, just by having one fund. So that can sometimes be easier for, if you're self-selecting. It's a whole minefield of lots of different funds. You want to spread your risk, so you can just choose a mixed investment fund. And the reason you want, probably want various different assets in there is because they have different risks associated with them. They can move in different directions and different market conditions, and they have, different timeframes that will be appropriate for them. So finding the right mix is, very important, and the time frame and your, the purpose for your given pot will determine what the right mix of assets is. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please, James. So as I said, the right allocation between asset types will depend on your goal for that pot of money, combined with your own risk appetite. So, for example, pensions have a really long time frame for investment. You can't access for all of us here, they have a long time frame for investment because we can't access the funds until age 57. Whereas, something like LISAs, if you're using it for a house purchase in the next couple of years, they'll probably have a shorter time frame because, hopefully you'll be buying a house in the next couple of years. ISAs can vary. They're probably somewhere in between the two others. And it will really depend about what purpose that money is serving. And that can be quite hard to understand because obviously life is quite uncertain. So, is that money in your ISA for a holiday next year or work on the house in 2 years? Or is it for, school fees in 10, 15 years? And they paint two quite different pictures, which is not always easy to understand. But the more you can kind of dig into that, the better you can then allocate your funds in your pot. So what does that kind of mean in real life, having these different asset allocations? What I've done here, hopefully it's, relatively easy to see, is a map to, real life example. And so this graph here maps a lower risk portfolio. This is an industry average. This isn't our portfolio. So this is just the industry average lower risk portfolio, which is red. So that has more of the fixed interest bond funds in there and cash, versus the higher risk green, which has more kind of equity funds and commercial property funds in there. And this is over a 15-year period. So what you can see quite clearly is that the green portfolio, the high risk portfolio, has returned more, as expected it would over the long term. But the cost of that is a much more volatile journey along the way. When you have periods of downturn, the downturns have been more severe and more prolonged, which is why, if you have your money in the LISA, in the higher risk portfolio, and you were invested in the 2008, 2009 crisis, rather the dip, it would have been 30%, which is in this blown up, on the blown up graph on the right, and would have lasted 3 years, as opposed to the lower risk portfolio, which only fell 5% and took less than 2 years to come back. And so that's a real life application of how your asset allocation is important for the different pots that you have. So therefore, understanding the time frame for each pot will impact the level of risk that is appropriate with each of the pots. And it also shows how having the asset allocation drives the long-term returns, but can also protect your wealth as well. And that's why, going back to James's time frame, the stage of life you're at will also have an impact on the right allocation here. So we've covered, types of assets, timeframes, asset allocation, risk. What I'm going to come on to now is another aspect of investing you may wish to consider. You may have picked up from our branding and from what you've seen before that we operate in the world of ESG, so environment, social governance with our investing. So I'm just going to talk about that for the next couple of minutes, if that's okay. So we can move on to the next slide. So as James mentioned earlier, what you may or may not realize is that pretty much everyone here will have investments, and this will be via your workplace pension. So unless you change the underlying investment and actively done something with your pension, you'll be in the default fund, which will have been selected by someone in your company. And so what I've just provided here an example of one of these default funds. In this case, it's just a FTSE tracker, so the top 100 companies in the UK, and the companies that you see here are Shell, BP, Rio Tinto, British American Tobacco. They are, we see these all the time in portfolios that when clients come to us and the portfolios that they have, which is unsurprising given the size of these companies. But some people might not want to be investing in these companies. So, how do we move away from that? And it wouldn't be a climate, presentation without a David Attenborough quote. I think this quote actually does, though, speak really powerfully to pension investments in particular. We are, with our pensions, we are investing for the future, and it does make us confront what that future actually looks like. So, how do we move away from this if we so want? If we could move on to the next slide. So, at the Path, we are looking to offer an alternative to those traditional investments. So we were set up with the express purpose of helping individuals move away from certain stocks and into more positive areas. So this is both directly by providing financial advice to individuals, but also by, kind of spreading the word like today. So within the investable universe, there's a subsector, which is ESG. That stands for Environment, Social Governance. These are funds that, in addition to investing for financial return, also take non-financial factors into account, like the environment, social, paying your tax and things like that. And so an ESG fund might exclude fossil fuels or something like that, for example. We actually look to operate in a further subsector, which is positive impact investing. And so that's investing in companies that are actively driving positive change. So that, renewables, healthcare, recycling, for example. I won't speak too long about our proposition on this, but if you'd like to research more about it, there's a campaign that you can look up called Make My Money Matter. This was set up, amongst others, by Richard Curtis. So he's the writer of Four Weddings and a Funeral, Notting Hill, Bridget Jones, Mr. Bean, Love Actually, Blackadder, pretty much anything with Hugh Grant or Rowan Atkinson in it. And obviously he has significant wealth himself and a platform, and went on a journey himself about positive impact investing and the role his investments were playing in that. And so he, set this campaign up with other people to help people realize that there is an alternative to traditional investing. So their research came up with this 21 times figure, which demonstrates the scale of impact that you can have with your investments. And I think it does also show that if you want to green your life, you have to look at investments as part of that as well. So how do you actually do this in practice? So the first step would be for your existing investments, and if you're considering looking at a new ISA or a new pension, to look at the investment options. Some pensions can just have 8 funds or less that you can choose from. Some have thousands of funds that you can choose from. And the more funds that you can have, the more that you can choose from, the more options you're going to have in terms of sustainable or green or ESG funds. So you can go onto the investment options, you can call them up, and then you can filter by ESG, environment, sustainability, climate, healthcare, whatever your preferences are. And then you can have a look at those funds and select it. And then you're naturally, putting into practice what we're looking at now. If anyone, by the way, wants to do, look up the research on this 21 times figure, I've put the link for the paper that they've done just there. So you can read it yourself if that's of any interest. So finally, one of the big questions around impact investing and ESG investing is, great, I'd like to do this, but I also want to get a positive return and I don't want to sacrifice returns. And our answer to this is, you don't have to. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So what we're looking at here, this graph shows the performance of what we call the MSCI World Index, which is just the world's largest companies or a selection of them, versus the MSCI World Socially Responsible Index. So it's a good like-for-like comparison, just with taking an index and then applying an ESG filter to that index. And so the green line is the ESG filtered index. And quite clearly you can see that the ESG filtered index has performed better. And this demonstrates that ethical investing and positive impact are not mutually exclusive. And we actually also believe that the argument for the performance argument for positive impact is as strong as the impact case for investing like this, because you're naturally investing in companies that are adapting for the future. Of course, I have to say, I can't guarantee that the future returns are going to look like this. But we think that's our position in terms of where the future is going and investing in these types of companies. So hopefully this has given you an idea about the types of assets and allocation that would be appropriate for your various pots, and provided some insight into the world of ESG and positive impact as well. So that's everything I had to cover just on that. I can't see any further questions, but if there are any further questions, I think we've got a bit of time now. So there's just one, so you're talking about kind of transferring a workplace pension to a personal pension. And someone's just mentioned it's not advisable as you will miss out on the free money as your employer contributes to your workplace pension as well. This is correct. That being said, if you have left that employer and that pension is now sitting dormant, you can, of course, transfer it, and there won't be you won't be missing out on the future employer contributions. And as James said, if you have multiple employers, you could end up quite easily with 5, 6, 7 plus pensions. So kind of having a personal pension, which you transfer your old workplace pensions into, and then having your active employer one alongside, is quite a neat way of managing that. I think that was
yeah, it looks like that's about it. You've clearly answered everyone's questions. There was a lot of information there, guys. Honestly, it was so useful. I found it very helpful, and I'm sure everyone else did. So thank you again to the two of you and to Path more widely for helping us out with today. If anyone does want, I mean, I can drop in here a link to Path. Obviously, you know, you guys can all Google them and find these two. I'm sure they'd be happy if you want to find them on LinkedIn or anything like that to answer any questions that you guys had going forward. Because, as I said, there was a lot to take on. There was a lot of times where I was like, just, I think, getting my head around points. But yeah, if you do want to follow up and go into a bit more detail, then I definitely advise you go for it. Thanks to you guys as well. I can see we had, you know, a really good turnout throughout, and it kept strong. So thank you very much for giving up your lunch breaks. Just to say a quick word on LYPN events. We've got lots coming up. We've actually got 2 in-person events coming up in May, which sounds like really good planning, but actually it's poor because we were supposed to have one in April and now they've been pushed. But you'll be able to find out about them throughout the next few weeks. We'll probably be going live with the marketing in the next week or so. And as I say, they are both going to be very exciting and in person. So we look forward to seeing you there. Otherwise, it just remains for me to say, yeah, have a great rest of your day. Thank you again, and do get in touch if any questions. Brill. And yeah, thanks, James. Thanks, Jack. I will end it now. Cheers, guys.